The courtroom was bustling with the usual noise, a low hum of conversations, the shuffle of papers, and the steady click of heels against the tile floor. Judge Thomas Lane, a man in his early 50s, sat behind the bench, reviewing his docket for the day. He had seen it all: speeding tickets, minor accidents, and an endless parade of people who, for one reason or another, found themselves on the wrong side of the law. His reputation for being tough but fair was well known in the town, and most of the cases he handled were straightforward. This particular morning was no different. Another case of a minor traffic violation had just been called. The defendant, a woman in her mid-40s, stepped forward to stand before him. She was dressed simply, jeans and a jacket, no frills or flashy accessories. Her expression was calm, composed, even if the circumstances weren't ideal. She had no legal representation with her, and there was nothing particularly remarkable about her appearance. To Judge Lane, she was just another person who had broken the law. His gaze lingered on her face for a moment, noting the composed, almost serene demeanor she carried, but he quickly dismissed any thoughts of further curiosity. This was his job, after all, to deliver justice, not to dwell on who people were outside the courtroom. "Ma'am, you've been cited for failing to yield at a stop sign." Judge Lane began, his voice clear and direct. "The fine for this violation is $100. How do you plead?" The woman, whose name was Evelyn Thomas, looked up at him, meeting his gaze with a quiet confidence. Her voice was steady when she answered, "Guilty, Your Honor." Judge Lane nodded, tapping his gavel lightly. "Very well. The fine will be set at $100. You'll have 30 days to pay it. Next case, please." The woman didn't hesitate. She reached into her bag and pulled out a small notebook, making a note of the proceedings. As she stood there, awaiting her turn to leave, there was nothing about her that seemed out of the ordinary. Judge Lane had seen hundreds of people come and go through his courtroom, and in his mind, Evelyn Thomas was just another name on a growing list. The case was closed, and his attention quickly shifted to the next one. It was routine, a matter of minutes in a long, exhausting day. The judge had no reason to think twice about the woman standing before him. As far as he was concerned, she was simply a lawbreaker who had to face the consequences of her actions, like so many others. Little did he know, Evelyn Thomas was about to turn his world upside down in a way he could never have anticipated. After the case was closed, Judge Lane leaned back in his chair, flipping through the next set of files, his mind already shifting to the next case. The courtroom began to empty, and the usual noise filled the air once more. The shuffle of feet, the soft murmurs of conversations, and the click of the court staff's shoes on the hard floor. But something caught his attention. A conversation among the clerks in the corner of the room, where a few of the younger court assistants were gathered, caught his ear. "I can't believe she was here," one of the assistants said in a hushed tone. "I mean, I know she's local, but I didn't realize it was her." "The Evelyn Thomas?" another clerk asked, her voice tinged with awe. "The best-selling author." The judge raised an eyebrow. Best-selling author. He couldn't help but overhear. His ears perked up slightly, though he didn't turn his head. The conversation seemed too far removed from the world of his courtroom to hold any real weight. After all, he had just fined the woman for a minor traffic violation. How could she possibly be someone of notable importance? The murmurs continued. "Yeah, I didn't believe it either until I looked it up. Her books, they inspire so many people. She's published bestsellers, and now she's in here, just like anyone else." Judge Lane's mind began to churn. Was this really the same woman who had just stood in front of him? He glanced over at the assistant who had mentioned her name, but the young woman quickly lowered her gaze, sensing the judge's curiosity. She continued quietly. Her latest book just hit the top of the charts. "I think she writes about overcoming obstacles, personal growth. It's pretty powerful stuff." Intrigued, but still doubtful, Judge Lane shook his head slightly and went back to his paperwork. He had seen plenty of people come through his courtroom, many of them with stories of hardships or triumphs of their own. He didn't see the need to make assumptions based on hearsay, especially when his day was filled with routine cases. Yet, something about this brief mention gnawed at him. It wasn't just that she was an author. It was the idea that someone with such a significant influence on others had been so easily dismissed in his courtroom. Later that evening, after a long day's work, curiosity got the better of him. Instead of heading straight home, Judge Lane found himself in front of his computer. He typed in her name, Evelyn Thomas, and the search results flooded his screen. What he discovered was more than he had expected. The woman who had appeared so ordinary, so like everyone else, was someone whose books had made waves in the literary world. Her writing, which dealt with issues of race, resilience, and personal growth, had resonated with thousands of readers. Her words had ignited conversations, sparked debates, and inspired a diverse audience across the country. The judge sat back, stunned. The woman standing before him that morning wasn't just anyone. She was a force, one whose voice had touched more lives than he could have imagined. Judge Lane leaned back in his chair, his fingers hovering over the keyboard, as the name Evelyn Thomas continued to linger in his mind. The information that had been passed along by his court staff felt almost surreal now. He had assumed it was some sort of mistake or exaggeration. After all, the woman had appeared so ordinary, and yet, as he scrolled through the articles, interviews, and reviews, the truth unfolded in front of him. Evelyn Thomas wasn't just a local author. She was a celebrated figure in the literary world. Her books, deeply rooted in themes of overcoming adversity and navigating systemic challenges, had struck a chord with readers from all walks of life. She had written several bestsellers, with her latest novel topping the charts. The books, lauded for their raw honesty and insightful perspectives on race, identity, and resilience, had sparked widespread discussions and become essential reading in many academic settings. As Judge Lane dug deeper into her biography, he found stories of her early struggles, how she grew up in a modest home, raised by a single mother who worked tirelessly to provide for her. Evelyn had faced personal challenges, including racism and the obstacles that came with being a woman of color in predominantly white spaces. Her journey to success had not been easy, but it was her passion for storytelling, her ability to connect deeply with her readers, that had allowed her to build a career as a best-selling author. He paused as he read a quote from a prominent book reviewer. Evelyn Thomas's words cut through the noise of our everyday lives, speaking to the quiet struggles and the hidden strength within us all. She's a voice that many didn't expect to see rise, but one that's impossible to ignore now. The judge felt a sense of disquiet wash over him. How could he have missed this? He, who prided himself on being meticulous in his work, had failed to recognize the true significance of the woman standing before him that morning. The more he learned, the more the puzzle pieces fell into place. She wasn't just any person who happened to pass through his courtroom. She was a cultural force, and he had treated her like any other defendant, offering her no more than a fleeting glance and a quick decision. His discomfort grew as he began to realize that his judgment had been hasty, based not on her actions, but on assumptions shaped by the way she presented herself. As the evening wore on, Judge Lane couldn't help but feel the weight of his mistake. He wondered about the deeper implications of his role in a justice system that often overlooked those who weren't immediately recognizable or conventional. He had heard her words today, guilty, and without a second thought, he had imposed the fine. He had seen only the infraction. What did he miss by not seeing her for who she truly was? It wasn't just about the fine anymore. It was about the gap between his perception of the world and the reality that lay beyond his courtroom walls. He had written her off, but this wasn't just a case he had adjudicated. This was a moment that would challenge his own biases, his own understanding of who deserves to be noticed, and for what reasons. The judge sat in silence for a moment, contemplating the unspoken truth he now faced. Evelyn Thomas wasn't just a defendant. She was someone whose influence stretched far beyond the walls of his courtroom, and he had almost dismissed it entirely. The days following his discovery were filled with discomfort. Judge Lane couldn't shake the thought of Evelyn Thomas, of how he had so easily dismissed her that morning. It wasn't just a fleeting feeling. It gnawed at him, resurfacing whenever he tried to focus on the cases at hand. He couldn't stop replaying the moment in his mind. Her calm, composed demeanor, her quiet plea of guilty, the way she seemed so unremarkable. And yet she was anything but. At night, when the weight of the day's decisions settled on his shoulders, Judge Lane found himself questioning his judgment. How could he have been so blind? A best-selling author, a voice that had sparked change and inspired many, had stood in his courtroom as just another defendant. The realization hit harder than he expected. She wasn't just any defendant who had made a simple mistake. She was someone who had overcome so much more in life. Someone who was, by every measure, worthy of a greater degree of respect than he had shown. Judge Lane knew that, as a judge, it was his job to remain impartial, to apply the law without bias. And yet, he couldn't help but wonder if his decisions had been influenced by assumptions, by the way Evelyn had dressed, the way she had looked, the way she had seemed to blend into the background like so many others who passed through the courthouse every day. He had assumed she was like everyone else, that she was just another person caught in a minor legal issue. But she wasn't. And that, he realized, was the crux of his failure. As he sat in his office, surrounded by piles of case files, the judge reflected on his own biases and how they had shaped his actions. It wasn't just about the fine he had handed down. It was about the broader implications of how people, particularly people of color, are often judged based on appearances or assumptions. He had learned this the hard way, and now he found himself questioning whether he had the right to keep wielding the power of the law if his own perceptions were so flawed. The discomfort became almost unbearable. He knew that Evelyn's work had impacted many lives, but had he, in some small way, contributed to the very system she critiqued in her writing? His gavel, which he wielded so confidently just days ago, now felt like a weight in his hand. The certainty that once guided his decisions began to falter, replaced by a troubling sense of doubt. He wondered if she had felt the same way he did, a quiet, unspoken judgment that had never been based on facts or merit, but on preconceived notions. Perhaps that's why she had entered the courtroom with such a quiet dignity. Perhaps she had been prepared for this, the routine dismissal of someone who didn't fit the mold of what society expected her to be. The realization stung him more than he anticipated. By the end of the week, Judge Lane found himself facing a difficult question. What would he do about it? What could he do? He could continue on, treating each case like any other, or he could find a way to make amends. But how? And could it ever be enough to undo the harm of a single moment? A moment that, to Evelyn, could have represented something far deeper than just a traffic fine. Evelyn Thomas, too, couldn't shake the feeling of the courtroom. Though she'd walked out of the building that morning with her head held high, the sting of being fined for a minor infraction lingered longer than she expected. She had been calm, almost mechanical, in how she'd handled the situation. Her upbringing had taught her to never show weakness, to endure in silence even when she was facing something that felt unjust. But beneath the surface, Evelyn was unsettled. It wasn't the fine that bothered her. It was the moment of dismissal. How she had been treated like just another person with no story, no significance beyond her offense. The judge's quick verdict had left her feeling invisible, as if her entire life's work and the challenges she had faced had amounted to nothing in his eyes. For a brief moment, she had felt like just another black woman being swept into a system that often didn't see her for who she truly was. She couldn't help but wonder, had he recognized her name? Had the judge, who had so quickly imposed the fine, known that the woman standing before him was the same person whose books had sparked conversations about race, resilience, and personal growth? Would he have acted differently if he had known that her words had been shaping minds, inspiring those who needed it most? But Evelyn had learned long ago not to dwell on what others thought of her. She knew how the world worked, how people often only saw what they wanted to see, based on the color of her skin, or the way she dressed, or the quiet demeanor she wore. People rarely recognized the layers that made up who she was, especially when she was dressed simply and walking through a mundane situation like a courtroom. To them, she was just another woman caught in the bureaucracy of life. As the days passed, Evelyn turned her attention back to the work that mattered. She had already started outlining her next book, one that would delve deeper into the stories of Black women who had been overlooked, underestimated, or disregarded. She wanted to explore the subtle ways society ignored them, even as they built empires, created art, and reshaped culture. The traffic violation had been an inconvenience, but it had also sparked something within her, a desire to write about these moments, these silences, when people like her were written off, and how they found the strength to rise despite it. Her writing had always been a means of channeling the frustrations of her life into something more meaningful, something that could inspire and challenge others. It was her gift, her way of navigating a world that too often failed to see her. And now, the courtroom moment was beginning to take shape in her mind as a powerful new chapter in her own journey, a story of resilience, yet again, but this time one that included a personal brush with a system that couldn't even recognize her for who she truly was. Little did she know, the judge was about to embark on a journey of self-reflection that would change the way he viewed her, and perhaps the world itself. It was late one evening when Judge Lane, still wrestling with his conscience, found the courage to do something he hadn't anticipated: reach out. He had spent days stewing over his actions, questioning everything from his motivations to his assumptions about Evelyn. He knew he couldn't undo the past, but perhaps he could make things right, even in some small way. He went online, searching for her publisher's contact information. After a few attempts, he found a direct email address for her literary agent. With trembling fingers, he typed out a message. He explained who he was, the case he had presided over, and how he had learned about Evelyn's success as an author. Then, in an act of humility that surprised even him, he asked if he might have the opportunity to meet with her, to apologize for his hasty judgment, and to express his genuine respect for her work. He didn't expect a response. After all, who would want to meet with a judge who had just fined them for a minor traffic violation? But to his surprise, just 2 days later, an email arrived in his inbox. It was from Evelyn herself. "Dear Judge Lane," the message began, "thank you for reaching out. I appreciate your honesty and the humility with which you've approached this. I would be happy to meet with you and discuss our experiences, though I must admit, I wasn't expecting such an invitation. Let me know when would be convenient for you." Judge Lane read the message several times, almost in disbelief. He had expected indifference, even perhaps a certain level of resentment. Instead, her response was gracious and thoughtful. He quickly replied, suggesting a time and place to meet, eager to take the next step toward understanding. A week later, they met in a small cafe near the courthouse. Judge Lane arrived first, nervously adjusting his tie as he waited for her. He had no idea what to expect from the encounter. What could he possibly say to someone like Evelyn Thomas, someone who had achieved so much, only to be treated as just another defendant in his courtroom? When she arrived, Evelyn exuded the same quiet confidence that had impressed him during the trial, but now there was an added warmth in her smile. She was dressed casually, in a simple blouse and jeans, but there was an undeniable presence about her, an aura of grace that spoke volumes. She didn't offer her hand immediately. Instead, she took a seat across from him, her posture relaxed but assertive. "Thank you for taking the time," Judge Lane said, struggling to find his words. "I just want to start by saying how sorry I am for not recognizing who you are. I should have known better. You've made such an impact with your work, and I should have treated you with the respect you deserve." Evelyn smiled softly, nodding. "I appreciate your apology, Judge, but I think the bigger question is why it took you this long to see me." Her words were gentle, but there was an underlying challenge in them, a challenge that would set the tone for their conversation. The cafe was quiet, save for the soft murmur of background chatter and the clink of cups being placed on tables. Judge Lane shifted uneasily in his chair, the weight of Evelyn's words hanging in the air between them. For a moment, neither of them spoke. It wasn't uncomfortable, but rather, it felt like the start of something important, a moment of reckoning. Evelyn took a slow sip from her coffee, her eyes never leaving him as she did. When she set the cup down, she leaned forward slightly, folding her hands together on the table. "Judge Lane," she began, her voice calm but direct, "I don't think you're a bad person. I think you've done what you were trained to do. Follow the law, make quick decisions. But what you missed is that I'm not just a name on a file or a woman standing before you for a traffic violation. I'm a person with a history, with a story, and I'm far more than what you saw that day." The judge felt his chest tighten at her words, a mixture of guilt and understanding rushing through him. He had prided himself on being fair, but fairness, he realized, wasn't about making decisions in a vacuum. It was about seeing the whole person, understanding the context of their life, and recognizing that no case, no matter how small, was ever just about the facts on paper. "I know it's not just about the fine," he replied quietly, his gaze fixed on the table. "I just didn't see beyond it. I should have done better, should have recognized that you weren't like the others who come before me." Evelyn's expression softened. "It's not just about recognition either, though. It's about the assumptions we make without even realizing it. I've been underestimated my whole life, and I know I'm not the only one. I've seen so many people, especially women of color, dismissed or written off, simply because they don't fit into a certain mold. It's like the system is designed to overlook us, to make us feel invisible." Judge Lane listened intently, the weight of her words sinking in deeper than he had anticipated. This was more than just a personal conversation. It was a window into the broader issues at play in his courtroom, in society. "You're right," he said, his voice heavier than before. "I didn't think about that. I didn't think about how the system often fails to see people for who they really are. It's easy to assume everyone is the same, that everyone is just a case to be handled quickly. But there's so much more that I missed, so much more that I need to understand." Evelyn's eyes softened. "It's not easy, Judge. It's not easy to admit that you've overlooked something, but it's the first step in change. And that's why I wanted to meet with you, because it's easy to make assumptions, but the hard part is owning up to them." The judge nodded slowly, a sense of clarity beginning to form in his mind. He had made a mistake, but perhaps this conversation, this moment, was the beginning of something different, something better. They sat there for a while, talking about books, race, and the complexities of the justice system. And as they spoke, Judge Lane realized that this wasn't just about him making amends. It was about learning, growing, and being willing to challenge his own biases. It was about seeing the humanity in everyone he encountered, not just the defendant, but the person. As the conversation continued, the initial discomfort faded, replaced by a sense of mutual respect. Evelyn's words had cut through the judge's defenses, exposing a side of the justice system he had never fully acknowledged. The more they talked, the more Judge Lane realized how much he had taken for granted in his role. He had been so focused on the law, on following protocol, and making quick decisions that he had forgotten the most important part of justice, the people behind the cases. Their conversation touched on the nuances of life that often go unnoticed, the ways in which society and the legal system can marginalize those who don't fit a particular mold. Evelyn spoke with a quiet yet powerful wisdom, drawing from her own experiences of being overlooked, of having to prove her worth in spaces where people had already decided what she could or couldn't do based on her race, gender, or background. Judge Lane listened, not with the intent to respond, but to understand. It was a humbling experience, one that forced him to examine his own assumptions and biases. He had once seen himself as a fair and just person, but now he saw how easily he could have been blind to the stories that didn't fit the typical narrative of what a defendant should look like. After a while, they fell into a comfortable silence, the weight of the conversation settling in their hearts. Evelyn broke the quiet with a thoughtful smile. You know, Judge, you don't have to change everything overnight. This isn't about perfecting yourself all at once. It's about recognizing when we've missed something and trying to do better moving forward. He nodded, grateful for her understanding. I think I've been living in a world where it's easier to make snap judgments than to slow down and really see people. It's not just about the cases or the law. It's about the lives behind them. Their conversation eventually came to a close, but not before they both agreed to keep in touch. It wasn't just a meeting of minds. It was the beginning of a shared journey toward a deeper understanding of justice, one that wasn't limited to the courtroom. It was a journey toward truly seeing people for who they were beyond the labels society placed on them. As Judge Lane walked away from the cafe that day, something inside him had changed. He felt lighter, as though he had gained a new perspective, a new clarity that would influence not just his work, but his entire approach to life. He knew he couldn't erase the past, but he could move forward with a new awareness, a commitment to truly listening and learning from those who had been overlooked. For Evelyn, the meeting had also been a moment of empowerment. She had been able to share her story, to express the challenges she faced, and to speak candidly about the deeper issues within the justice system. It wasn't about getting an apology. It was about having her humanity acknowledged. And in that, she found a sense of closure, knowing that her words had sparked a change in someone who had the power to make a difference. Their paths had crossed for a reason, and as they parted ways, they both knew that their meeting had set in motion a shift toward a more compassionate, open-minded approach to justice.